to start off with a basic rundown of the history of Islam, and then we're going to go into how to use this information to reach out to Muslims. And in this section, we'll get in a little bit more detail about some of the concepts as it affects Muslims, because there's certain areas where you can cause them to think in ways they wouldn't normally want to think by asking the right questions in the right way. Yeah, a direct frontal attack is not a good idea. If you criticize Islam, Muslims are commanded to make Allah's word supreme. So I did a formal debate with Jay Smith against Anjum Chowdhury and Mizanur Rahman 2 years ago. They're both in prison now because they swore allegiance to ISIS, which caused my wife to make me put a new security system in the house. But those guys, I didn't feel pressure during the debate. Televised debate, it's on YouTube. I didn't feel any pressure because I knew nothing I said was going to change their mind. Because they were there for one reason, and that was to defeat us. They weren't there to discuss and reach a conclusion and reach a truth, the truth of the matter. They were there simply to win. And because of the command to make Allah's word supreme, most Muslims, not all, but most Muslims have interpreted that as meaning in any situation you have to win. It can mean in a physical battlefield, it could mean in a verbal confrontation, but if you strike an aggressive posture, they will respond in kind. They will not back down. Their whole idea is they have the final revelation of God, they have the truth, you're mistaken, and so there's no real point to listen to you. But it is a good point, but it is their point to win. And so in the debate, Anjum Chowdhury and Mizanur Rahman said the most ridiculous things. They didn't care. They were trying to distract the audience from the points that were being made by, they call it red herring, just drawing something across to distract the audience from what the debate was about. And so they would bring up stuff about the Gospels. We were debating the origins of Islam. Bringing up stuff about the Gospels is simply an attempt to distract because they were doing so poorly in the debate and they were trying to get into something different. So the reason we have this methodology is because what you're trying to do is to have a discussion with them on a personal level and ask non-aggressive questions in such a way that it allows them to reach a conclusion on their own. Because if you tell them a truth, mentally they can put up a wall and just ignore you. And what they do is they fall back on I can't answer that, but this religion's been around 1,400 years. There's plenty of people that can, experts. I just don't know it, and I'm not going to listen. So they can put up that wall if you just tell them something. But if you ask a question that creates a discomfort within them, it can allow them to surface the truth for themselves. Then you've changed the dynamic completely, because they can deny what you say. They can't deny what their own mind says. And so that's part of what we're going to get to, is a way to reach them in a way that allows them to surface the truth for themselves so they come to their own conclusions. You're not telling them there's problems. They're going, oh, wait a minute, I got a problem here. And then as they pursue it, they'll eventually realize either that they have to give up pursuing it in order to hang on to their faith, or they'll reach the conclusion there's problems with their faith, one or the other. Majority most likely will stick to I'm just going to give up looking because I don't like the answers, and they'll stick with their faith. And that is partly because the Quran emphasizes again and again and again, if you doubt, if you do this, if you do that, you will burn in hell. And so they're kind of afraid to actually address these issues themselves. That's what happened as we talked about Mark Gabriel. So he asked the wrong questions, and he was tortured for 8 days, and by the Egyptian secret police. The government was doing it to him because they were accusing him of apostasy. They accused him of having left the religion. And mentally he was saying, he kept telling them, I haven't left the religion. He was just asking questions. And at the end of the 8 days he said, well, now I am. So Muhammad was born to Abdullah and Amina in about the year 570 in Mecca, which is on the western side, about halfway up the Saudi Arabia, what now Saudi Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula. It's just on the edge of what they call the Hijaz, the Upper Highlands region there. According to Islamic stories, it was a major trading center, and the Quran refers to the mother of cities as if it was a great trading center, great city, but it doesn't appear on any map till 200 years or so after Muhammad's death. Nobody in the ancient past had ever done maps. They did maps, but nobody had ever mentioned it before because it was such a minor off-roads place. It became, in retrospect, an important place to Muslims, but it wasn't at the time. So he's born in this dusty, basically, trading place in a valley, and his father died just before he was born. His mother died within a year or two after he was born, and then he was given to a relative who then died, and so he was basically passed around as a child and was raised by Bedouins who would take him and feed him and take care of him in the desert, because most Arabs at that time considered Bedouins to be a hardier, stronger group of people than the city dwellers. The Bedouins, the ones that wandered about, the traditional, when you think of Arabs and their tents or whatever, that would be the Bedouin. They thought that would make him stronger and better. And so as he became an adult, they said at the time, he was noted for his honesty and his integrity and his hard work. And he got a job eventually when he was in his 20s. He got a job with a trading company, a caravan company, and began to travel to what's now Syria and Jordan and areas like that. And throughout his life, he came into contact with, he had the native religions there, which were kind of polytheistic, lots of little idols. In Mecca, they had the temple they call the Kaaba. It means cube. At the time, there was 350 idols in it, and various tribes would come there and worship there during their time of the year. They were set to come there, and the locals would make a few little coin off of taking care of them and such. So he was raised in a polytheistic environment, but there were some people there who said that's not true, that there's only one God. But he had this kind of a vague notion of one true God. The religion he came into contact other than polytheism the most growing up was Judaism. Yemen was a Jewish nation for centuries. Most people have no idea about that. When Muhammad was eventually driven out of Mecca, he went to what's now called Medina, and there, out of the 11 tribes living in that area, 3 of them were Jewish and 8 of them were just whatever else. So you had 3 Jewish tribes. You had all these Jewish influences everywhere. So you'll see that in the Quran and in his life. If you look through the Quran, lots of Old Testament stories, lots of references. There's dietary laws in Islam. There's formalized prayers. There's all these sorts of things that God is one, as in a simple unity. That is, there's no Trinity. There's only the unity of God, and that He has no child. He neither begets nor is begotten, and all that sort of thing. So he's raised more with a Jewish influence. Now, in that part of the world at the time, we're talking, like I said, he's born 570, so we're getting 610 is when he had his first revelation from God, as he said. But the only Christian-type groups he ran into were the outcast groups. In that world of the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, when you had a problem politically, you took care of it by burning buildings and killing people. You didn't negotiate with people you disagreed with. You just simply exterminated them. So there began to be controversies within the church once it became they call a religio licta, a legal religion within the Roman Empire, which is now we're talking about based in Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, that empire. Well, the question becomes, okay, now that we're allowed to discuss things freely, how many natures does Jesus have? Is he divine? Is he only divine? Is he human? Is he only human? Is he a blending of divine and human? Is he 2 natures, 1 person? And so the emperor doesn't give a hoot about theology, but the emperor does care about unity within his kingdom. And so he said, won't you guys get a council together and discuss it and come to a decision, and whatever you guys decide, I'll enforce. So the official declaration is that Jesus is 1 person with 2 natures. Divine and human natures are different and can't mix, so he's 1 person, 2 natures. But what if you believe he's kind of a halfway blend of 2? Technically called a monophysite, meaning 1 nature. What if you believe that, like the Coptic churches in Egypt now? Well, the Roman Empire would say, desist in teaching this, and if you insist on continuing, then you will be punished. And when they continued to do that, they sent down troops, they burned churches, they killed people, they slaughtered them. It was an enforced orthodoxy, enforced correct belief. So what do you do if you want to keep believing that Jesus has a blended nature? Do you stay in the cities, or do you go out in the country, out away from cities? Well, later on, the big controversy is, does Jesus have one will or two wills? Called the Monothelite discussion. Does he? And it became known as Monothelite heresy, which is that Jesus has divine and human will, is the official declaration. But some groups insisted on saying you can't have two wills in one person. They'd be arguing with himself all the time. Those groups became the outcasts, and they were driven out of the areas like Syria now, Lebanon, those areas. That's where that idea popped up, and so those churches were driven out. So where do you go to get away from the Roman Empire? You go to the backwoods. You end up in Jordan, you end up in Saudi Arabia, you end up in those areas. So the Christians Muhammad had interaction with growing up when he was learning about these various religions weren't traditional Christians. They were kind of like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons at the time. They were different. And so in the Quran, that's reflected by, it'll discuss various things, such as it says, desist, do not say Trinity. And it says that, and it describes the Trinity in the Quran. God the Father, Mary the Mother, Jesus the Son. Has anybody heard of that as the description of the Trinity? No, that's not the Trinity. Father, Son, Holy Spirit's a Trinity, eternal God. Where's Mary? How's that? And so apparently there were groups there that taught that, and he accepted that as this is what Christians believe. So when he was 25, he was working for this company, and Khadijah was the woman who owned the company. She was a wealthy, successful businesswoman and a widow, and she was about close to 40 years old. He was 25, and she liked him. He was honest, hardworking. She got a lot of money. She made money off his trips, and she knew that the money that she put in would come back. And so she proposed marriage to him. And think about how this changes over time. At the time, you have a successful businesswoman in the Middle East who proposes marriage to a man. That changes after the advent of Islam. When he was about 40 years old himself, he used to take times out as kind of a pilgrimage of his own to the mountains near Mecca, and he would go into the caves and meditate and pray and try to figure out what's going on just to get away from things, fast, do all that sort of stuff. When he's about 40 years old, he said that a being appeared to him and showed him a piece of paper and said, Iqra, which in Arabic means read or recite. And he said, I can't. And the being squeezed him until he couldn't breathe. And then he said again, Iqra. And he said, I can't. And he squeezed him. And he said again, read or recite. And he said, I can't. And the third time that being let him go, he could see. And the first verse of the Quran was revealed. And later, at first he thought he may perhaps be possessed by a demon or something. But later they decided, he went back and his wife hid him under sheets and had to get her uncle to calm him down. Her uncle was a type of Christian. They said he wrote the Gospels in the Hebrew tongue, which seems kind of weird because the Gospels weren't written in Hebrew, but it's a good story. So anyway, later on they decided this being who squeezed him and gave him this revelation was Jibril, or Gabriel in English. That Gabriel had brought the first revelation. So the religion works like this. Allah, God Almighty, speaks to Gabriel. Gabriel takes the message to Muhammad, and he repeats it to Muhammad until he memorizes this verse, this chapter, whatever it is. And once he gets it down, Gabriel leaves, and Muhammad tells his followers, who then memorize it. The written versions didn't come out till 40 years or so after him, 30, 40 years after Muhammad's death, the first written versions of the Quran. And the Quran comes from the same root word as Iqra. Quran in Arabic, just triconsonantal language. Arabic is 3 consonants make words, and you change vowels around to make different new words. And so, since Iqra meant recite, Quran means recitation. And so the idea is it was not a written book, it's to be memorized and brought into your heart, and you're supposed to be able to recite it from memory, which is why Mark Gabriel is what they call a Hafiz, someone who had memorized the entire Quran. Mark was 12 when he finished memorizing the entire Quran. The Quran's about the length of the New Testament. It's not short, but that's lots of words to memorize every word perfectly. And so if you do that as a young person in the Middle East, you're like a celebrity at the time. So he gets the word from Gabriel. God tells Gabriel. Gabriel tells Muhammad. Muhammad tells his followers. And then 30 years later, they write it all down because people who had memorized it were beginning to die, and they wanted something to keep a record of it. Not too long after that, his wife Khadijah dies, and he begins to get persecuted because he begins to tell the people in Mecca that their relatives were burning in hell because they worshiped false idols, which didn't make him very popular with his relatives. Telling, Mamaw is burning in hell doesn't make very many people happy. So he made himself very unpopular, and they eventually they treated him badly. They cursed him, they beat him, they threw. He'd be praying near the Kaaba, and they would put camel intestines on his back while he was bowing. Anything to humiliate him and cause him problems. Eventually, the word gets out they're going to kill him because they can't take it because nobody can get him to shut up about this new religion. At that time, his cousin Ali and a friend, not Abu Bakr, but cousin Ali and another man basically hide in his tent and pretend to be him so the killers can't get him, and he takes off for Mecca. The reason he went to Mecca was he had gained followers over these 10 years of being persecuted as people came to the Kaaba to do their own worship. He began to gain followers from other Arabs that were coming there to worship their own gods by convincing them that there's only one true God and they should follow that. And so the year before he left Mecca, he got from the new Muslims that were now living in Medina, he got a pledge, they call it the Pledge of Women. And that's the first pledge of Aqaba. And this pledge said that we will support you if you come up here. We'll take care of you. There's no problems. And it's called the Pledge of Women because they didn't promise to fight for him. A year later, they made the second pledge of Aqaba where they said, if you come here, we will take care of you, and your enemies will be our enemies. In other words, we'll fight. And then he left Mecca and went to Medina. When he got to Medina, there was about 11 tribes living in the area. Oops, I just bumped something. About 11 tribes living in the area. 3 were Jewish. Within about a year and a half, the first Jewish tribe, he had enough followers at this point that he said, take your stuff and get out. I'm having trouble because the Jews weren't accepting him. He had these 3 Jewish tribes, and he said, I'm one of your prophets. And they said, the only prophet left is supposed to be one of our brothers, and you're not one of our brothers. You're not from our people. You're from the Ishmael side of Abraham. You're not from the Isaac side, and the prophet should come from the Isaac side. So the Jews rejected him. First tribe, year and a half later, get out. They take their stuff and leave. About a year after that, the second tribe, he's had enough of them. Get out, leave your stuff, but get out. And then the third tribe, about 2 years after that, he says, he asked a man who was dying from wounds in a battle that they blamed on the Jews. He said, pronounce judgment. And he said, kill the men, keep the women and children and property. So that day, in a trench they had built to protect the city from an invasion, they cut off between 600 to 800 Jewish men's heads that day and kept the women, children, and their property. So his relations with Jewish people was not very good during his lifetime. He thought they would receive him with open arms, that he would be accepted as, I'm bringing this God to the people here. And they did not accept him, and it caused a lot of problems. And he ended up, and to this day, Muslims and Jews typically don't get along too well, partly because of the existence of Israel. The Muslims can't accept that, and partly because Muhammad said so many horrible things about Jews, and the Quran says it. The Quran says that Allah became so upset with the Jews that he turned many of them into monkeys and pigs. And so there'll be cartoons in the Middle East to this day where they'll show people with yarmulke, a monkey with a yarmulke kind of thing, because that's what the Quran said happened to the Jews. He treated the Christians much better. There's good evidence that suggests that his wife Khadijah was originally a Christian, and that his uncle Waraka, who told him he was a prophet, was a Christian of a sort. And so he had very nice things to say about Christians. Christian theology he had problems with, and that shows up in the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad, but he liked Christians in general. They didn't treat them badly. The bad treatment comes later. The first 10 years of his life as a prophet, every bit of the Quran revealed during them, they call the Meccan verses. Those were during the period when he was in Mecca. Those are all the peaceful verses. Those are the verses that say, get along with each other, don't argue unless it's in a better way, treat everybody well, say to you, your religion, to me, mine, and go separate ways. That all comes from the period when it was him and his wife and his 13-year-old cousin and just a few followers. There's nothing violent in those verses because, I mean, would it make any sense to tell a woman, a 13-year-old, and a man to go start a war? No. So what happens over time is, once he gets driven to Medina, you get new verses that say, before you were told to be peaceful, now I'm saying it's okay to defend yourselves. And then the next set is, if the leader calls you to fight in defense, you have to go. So it goes from peaceful to you may defend yourself to you have to fight to defend yourself. And then the ones about kill the infidel, the ones you read about in the news and such, those verses came later. So what do you do? What do you do if you're a traditional Muslim and you're trying to interpret the Quran? How do you get this verse says peace, this verse says fight? What do I do? Some say, well, this violent verse was to a specific situation and the peaceful is all time. Well, that doesn't work too well in traditional Islam because the Quran is the eternal word of God. The words are eternal, so you can't say this is just for this time. So what happens is there's two verses in the Quran that came out, and this came as a result of taunting by Jews. Jews would show him that he had contradicted a previous revelation. And they would laugh and they say, is your God senile? Did he forget what he said 2 years ago? Because he said this and now he says this, they contradict. Well, then Muhammad got a new revelation. And the new revelation says if you get two verses that contradict each other, the one that comes last supersedes or abrogates all the other ones before. Now, if you're a devout Muslim and there's conflicts going on around you, do you follow the peaceful verses or do you follow the violent verses? Well, we started peaceful, then you may defend, then you must defend, then fight to slaughter. Which ones came last? That's why there's violence in the Middle East and has been throughout history. I wrote an article for an encyclopedia called The Mahdist Revolution. It's about Sudan in the 1880s when a guy declared he was their Messiah figure and started killing people. There's been hundreds of people over the years declaring they were the Mahdi, the Messiah figure of Islam, and led violent wars. There's been violence from day one in Islam. Muhammad, during his lifetime, led or commissioned more than 80 battles. He lost teeth in battles. He had his cheek torn. They thought he was dead a couple of times. Muslims defend this by saying that this is what God told him to do, just as in the Old Testament, God told the Jews to fight. It's not that big a deal, so if you try to use the violence of the Quran to try to stump a Muslim, what you're doing is he'll just simply say, turn it on you and say, well, what about the stuff in the Old Testament? Did God tell anybody to fight there? Didn't it say slaughter everybody? So what are you complaining to me about? Same God, right? So that's where the violent part comes from. He died of an illness when he was 62 years old or so, and the question became, who takes over? His followers assumed that he would be with them until the end of the world, and now he's gone and the end of the world hasn't come. So what do? Do you follow traditional Arab methods? And what you do is get a council of elders together who picks the best guy to lead? Or is his family supernaturally guided and special, and you should only choose an immediate member of his family? If you follow the traditional ways of picking the best leader, the tradition in Arabic is Sunnah, from which you get Sunni. So the Sunni Muslims come from the group who said you should vote the best guy in. Now, supporter of Ali, his once 13-year-old cousin, now older, who's his nearest male relative, in Arabic, a supporter of Ali is Shia Ali, which is a supporter of Ali, from which you get the word Shiite. So the Shiite-Sunni split happened when Muhammad died. It's not something, their theologies developed over centuries, but the split started the day Muhammad died. So that's an ancient battle that's been going on since way back. And over centuries, they began to diverge in theological interpretations of verses and such. So now we're going to jump forward. Muhammad died 632 June. The Muslim armies began a conquest of the world because Muhammad said, Allah has commanded me to fight the people, not a specific people, the people, until they say there's no God but Allah and Muhammad's a prophet of Allah. So their armies began to expand out of Saudi Arabia. He died 632. Within 100 years, they'd conquered the Persian Empire, the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, half of Italy. 732, 100 years after Muhammad's death, was the Battle of Tours, 35 miles from Paris. The Muslim armies had already made raids into the Rhine Valley in Germany at this point. So they were trying to conquer the world for Islam, and a guy named Charles Martel, a Frankish, they call him mayor of the palace, he led the Frankish army that defeated the Muslims near Paris, like I said, at the Battle of Tours or Poitiers, depending on which version you read. about 35 miles Paris, drove the Muslims across the Pyrenees, where they remained in Spain for the next 680 years, or 780 years. So there was Muslim rule in parts or all of Spain for almost 800 years until Isabel and Ferdinand drove the last of them out in 1489. The Muslim armies did not stop trying to conquer the world, so they continued to fight. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, fell in 1453. And then the last time the Muslims tried to overrun Europe was the Battle of Venice in 1683. So you had over 1,000 years of Muslim attacks on Europe, either raids or... By the time the Crusades started, there had already been over 400 attacks against Europe. So the Crusades in a historical context are understandable. They were horrible. They were brutal, they were vicious, they were stupid. But they're understandable. When somebody keeps attacking you, how long do you put up with it? 400 years of attacks. So they're at least understandable in that context. Now the Muslims that came to America, now we're jumping forward in time again, the Muslims that came to America are different than the typical Muslims in Europe. The Muslims in Europe went there for jobs, and they wanted to keep their culture, they wanted to keep their religion the same. The Muslims that came to America were typically the more liberal Muslims. In the Quran, and it says again and again that Muslims are to enjoin the right and forbid the wrong. Muslims have almost always interpreted that to mean that not only do I have to behave in certain ways, but I have to make sure my neighbors who are Muslims behave that way too, such that you correct your neighbor if he stops going to the mosque for the message on Fridays. Well, what happens when you got every part of your life ruled by Sharia, which is God's law of how you should live? What happens when your neighbors are bugging you all the time and they're following and watching what you're doing, because their entrance to paradise is partly dependent on their behavior, and they're commanded to make sure everyone does the right thing. So you got neighbors watching you and telling you what to do. What if you're sick of that? What if you just want to get away from that kind of mentality? You still want to be a Muslim because you think it's the truth, but you're tired of it. Well, you go to the New World and get away from those ties. So the Muslims that came to the U.S. were typically Muslims who were Muslims in name and belief, but did not like that all-encompassing Islamic lifestyle. And so that's why we have less problems with terrorism in the U.S. besides great intelligence and great police forces in the U.S. It's also because a different kind of Muslim came here. In Europe, it was different. In Europe, some of them were like that in the 70s, and then in the 80s, particularly the late 70s and 80s, many Muslims began to convert, young Muslims began to convert to Christianity, which led to a backlash where the older Muslims were asking themselves, what do we do wrong? How did this happen? We need better and more teaching. And who better to supply that than the people in Saudi Arabia with all the money? And Saudi Arabia follows the most conservative form of Islam there is, and those are the ones who sent the teachers to the Europe, and that's why they tend to be more violent and more conservative Muslims in Europe than in the U.S. That's why you have Muslims worshiping in churches along with Christians, but doing their own thing in the U.S., but you wouldn't have that in Europe. So it's a more liberalized, in general. Obviously, there's always individuals. So what is a Muslim supposed to do? He's supposed to pray 5 times a day. He plays the opening chapter of the Quran, called the Fatiha, means the opening. It's about 8 verses long. They pray that up to 27 times a day. There's a ritual prayer where they bow. They have to do the ablution, the wudu, the ritual washing first. Wash your right hand, your left hand up to your elbow. Wash your face, wash your nose, wash your mouth, wash your feet. They do this ritual, then they do their 5 prayers a day, 5 sets of prayers, and they pray that opening chapter of the Quran up to 27 times a day, plus others. And there's some room in there throughout the day where they could add in a little something, but for the most part, it's always completely ruled exactly how they're to do things. What do they believe about God? They believe God is completely transcendent, that He is so different than us that you can't know God. In Christianity, we have Jesus, the Word of God. In Greek, logos, so the mind rationality of God is what He reveals as how God thinks, how God feels. You watch Jesus, that tells you how God is. He's the mind of God. They don't have the logos in Arabic and Islam. They have the thelos, which is the will of God. You know two things about God in Islam. You know His will, because it's in the Quran. He's told you what to do, and in the teachings of Muhammad. And then you know His power. He created the universe, and He created hell for people who disobey. So you got a very powerful, very distant God that tells you have to do certain things, or you will burn in hell. But if you do certain right, you go to one of the 7 levels of Jannah, which is paradise. Sometimes people use it at heaven. It's not heaven because God's not there. It's paradise. You heard of 7th heaven? That phrase is common. That's actually from Islamic theology. There's 7 levels of paradise. Muhammad said he visited those levels one day. His wife said his body was beside me that night when he went to visit, so I think it was a spiritual journey, but some Muslims hold to a physical journey where he left Medina and went to Jerusalem to the Temple Mount, where the Temple Mount is, and then ascended to the 7 heavens. I see the 2nd or 3rd level he met a prophet named Jesus there who wasn't quite to the highest level, but was pretty good. And then he met various prophets, and along the way he bargained with God to get 70 prayers a day down to only 5 a day because he was there to help out his people. So you got God is completely in control of the universe. In Christian theology, we have primary and secondary causality within the universe. Primary God. God upholds, in Colossians it says, God upholds, Jesus upholds the universe in existence. And yet we're able to act within it. So there's more than one cause of activity within the universe. In Islamic theology, there's only primary causality. Everything happens because Allah decrees it. You may think you're doing things, and in philosophy they call it occasionalism, which is, I decided to pick up this remote, I thought it, and God made it happen. Because I cannot physically make anything happen, because God is the only power in the universe. Where was I going to go with that?
So who has control over the thoughts?
You control your thoughts. God controls the physical actions of that. And that's why, I know what I was going to say about that. And that's why they say, would you like to meet tomorrow for lunch? And they say, Inshallah, I'll meet you at lunch. If Allah wills, because they don't control anything. In the 1980s in Pakistan, they were tired of using Western books, so they decided to have a Islamic physics textbook made up. And so it says if you combine 2 parts hydrogen with 1 part oxygen, inshallah, it becomes water. Because nothing happens unless God directly decrees it and causes it to happen. So what if you're going to go kill yourself by flying airplanes into a building? Why would you do that? Well, number one, you think, I need to do this. And this is, of course, not directly to do with Islam itself, but I want to give you a little background into the thinking of the 9/11 attackers. They sacrificed themselves for you. That's the motivation of the 9/11 attackers. They were there for you. They sacrificed themselves not to attack you, but to help you. As bizarre as that seems, either you worship Allah or you worship something else other than Allah. And Allah is just, some people say, short, a contraction of Al-Ilah, which means the God. Or else, and some people say it's a formal name, that God's name is Allah. Depends on which source you look at. Either you worship God or you're worshiping an idol. In America, they say, this is the reasoning among the theologians, we worship money, sex, and power. So how do you attack that? You can't attack sex directly, but you can attack Madison Avenue. You can't attack money directly, but you can attack the World Trade Center. You can't attack the power that's enslaving us. This is satanic powers enslaving us. You can't attack the military might directly, but what if you attack the Pentagon? So they're trying to slay the idols that we worship, and then in our devastation we'll realize our utter dependency on God for our existence, and then we will realize the truth of Islam. They did it not because they hated us so much, they did it because they wanted to help us. Now, a suicide bomber, that's a recent thing. That didn't start till the 1980s, and among Shiites, and 1990s among Sunnis. And their thinking is, I'm going to get there, and I'm going to push this button because that's what I need to do. Allah may allow the bomb to go off and destroy everyone except for me. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. Allah controls everything, so I may live. And so that's the kind of mentality that God directly controls everything that allows them to do that. Does that kind of make sense for you guys, what the thinking is? Because people don't do evil because they think they're doing evil. They do evil because they think they're doing good. And that's what they thought they were doing. Suicide bombers are trying to stop the oppression of other Muslims. They say the West has attacked Islam. That's how they look at anything, any military activity in the Middle East. That's the Islamic homeland. And if we have any military forces there at all to the most conservative Muslims, that means we're attacking Muslims, we're attacking Islam. And in that case, their one command is to do whatever it takes to get us out. And so they're doing good by doing the suicide bombing and such. So how do you reach people who believe that God is the ultimate control of everything, and that you don't actually control anything, that their religion is the final and true revelation, that Christianity's been corrupted by people looking for money and power, and that Jesus was only a Muslim, and they know that because the Quran, Jesus says, I'm just a Muslim. How do you reach people that are that convinced they're right? They follow, theologically, there's a whole spectrum of way people's, how they approach their religion. You got a one end called fideism, for the word for faith, the Latin word for faith, and the other end is pure rationalism. If I can't prove it, I don't want to believe it. Unitarians traditionally came from the rationalist end. The Trinity can't be proven logically, therefore I reject it. I'm a Unitarian. And then the other end, you get groups like Mormons, which believe because of a burning in the breast, or you end up with Muslims who believe because it's been revealed. The earliest apologetics that the Muslims did was nothing at all to prove rationally that the religion was true. The earliest apologetics they did was battle. How can I prove my religion's from God? Well, how about if a bunch of guys on camels and horses come out of the desert and conquer the Persian and the Byzantine Empire? How's that possible if God's not behind it? And so for the earliest Muslims, they didn't have books and they didn't have writings on what's wrong with everything else. They knew they were right because they're victories. There was no other way they could have it. How could a bunch of guys defeat that much of the world out of a desert? It makes no sense at all unless God's behind it. And so that was their rationality. So now you get to the modern times where Muslims are more rational, but not as educated as we might like. Literacy in the Middle East is at horrible levels. Egypt leads the Middle East with 65% of the people can read. That's the highest levels in the Middle East. So if you can't read for yourself, which is what if I say something here and you guys think I sound like I'm nuts, you go, well, I'm going to look that up because you can read. What if you can't read? You go talk to another person who knows about it, who can read, and see what they say, and you decide which authority you believe. Well, in the Middle East, and since most people there can't read, they go to their imam, their religious leaders, their whatever level of religious leader there is, and they ask, how's this work? And he tells them, and they go, all right, he said it. I don't know, I can't read the book, but he said it. And so, yeah.
Aren't they reluctant to print the Quran too, because it is the eternal word of God and it can be corrupted?
Well, they say that originally the Quran was revealed in 7 ahruf, which is 7 dialects. And so once you put in the vowel points, because as I said, it's a consonantal language, it's kind of like Hebrew. It's written just in consonants, and you're supposed to know what the vowels that go in are. But if you put different vowels in different places, it changes the meaning of words. So to kind of give themselves some leeway, they say, well, there's 7 different ways that Allah has revealed it. And so you can put in different vowels the way you want. The original earliest Qurans were just in consonants, kind of like shorthand versions. The main problem they have isn't with printing it so much, it's with translating it. There's no such thing as a translation of the Quran. It'll say a commentary, it'll say something of that sort, but you will not see the word translation on a official Quran. You won't see the word translation on it, because at that point, in order to change it from Arabic to English, they have to interpret the words, and no one has the authority to interpret Allah's words. You just see them and accept them. So the Quran exists only in Arabic. What you read in English is man's attempt to comment on what they think it meant, but that's not the Quran. If you can't read Arabic, you haven't read the Quran. It's an Arabic-only document. God speaks Arabic. He's smart. He can speak English, but Arabic is his language. All right, so how do you reach the people that have these kind of mindset? They have to earn their way to heaven, or they're not really sure about that, because some parts of the Quran say Allah chooses who He will. Other part says if you have faith, you'll go to, I said heaven, I meant paradise. Allah chooses who goes to paradise, who goes to hell. Other parts say your faith determines. Other parts say your works determine. They don't know. There's no such thing as salvation in Islam. They believe, some of them are very confident they've done enough to, there's an angel walking on each side. One writes down their good deeds, one writes down their bad deeds. They weigh the books at the end of their life. Which way do you go? Well, some are very, very confident that they've got a lot of good deeds. Others are very much aware that Muhammad said you have to do your prayers perfectly 5 times a day, everything perfectly, or else it doesn't count. He said specifically, if you pass wind while you're doing your prayers, you got to go back and clean up and start all over again. Well, what if you couldn't make prayers that day? You can never make it up. What if you've done something illegal? Well, you can never. Well, how much do you have to do to make up for what you've done wrong? There's a tension there. So what you have is people that have been commanded to do certain things. You have people that really do want to go to paradise, not hell, but are terrified because they're told if they ask the wrong questions, they'll go to hell. How do you reach people that are brainwashed in that way? Those prayers they pray every day, and I'm going to give you a little bit more of the Muslim mindset here first. And just to warn you that this presentation is really a 3 or 4 hour presentation, and rather than obviously rushing through it, which would be really harmful, we're going to start into it, go as far as we can, and any questions, any interactions you want to have, please. This part. That was the background part, so we can understand what's going on here with this part. And we're going to give a little bit more in-depth information to let you understand just how desperate their situation is. And it's called Our Family in Bondage for a reason. They're humans. They're made in the image of God. They need better than what they have. They have a desperate belief that only they have to please this distant potentate who's commanded them what to do. But they can never really live up to that level. We'll discuss some of those problems with it. So how do you reach them? It's daunting. How can you share the good news to Muslims who believe that doubting the Quran's a sin? If you doubt it, you're sinning. The Gospels, which we have, are corrupted. How do you reach them? That Jesus was no more than a prophet. That Jesus was not raised in the fact dead, and in fact never died. In the Quran it says that they only believed that he died. It's a lie we accepted, that they were fooled. And some people say, and some Muslims interpret that as saying Simon of Cyrus was crucified, not Jesus. Some say doubting Thomas. Some others say others. But the person was made to look like Jesus, put on the cross and died. Jesus was taken directly to heaven because God really likes him. Once again, I said heaven, I meant paradise. I'm sorry. Christian terminology to Islamic terminology gets tricky. Believing the Trinity is an unpardonable sin. There's only one unpardonable sin in Islam. It's called shirk. That is assigning or ascribing partners to Allah. So if you say that Allah has a son, then you have committed the unforgivable sin in Islam. What do you do if all you hear about is hell all your life, and now somebody's saying, hey, let me tell you about the Son of God? They're terrified to hear about it if they really take their religion seriously. They believe they can measure up by believing in Allah, His Prophet Muhammad, and by doing good deeds over bad deeds. Just get them enough of those. How do you reach them? How can we talk to people in a way that creates greater interest instead of in hearing our gospel in such a challenging world? This is the hardest way. This is the hardest group to reach, I think, in the world, Muslims, because of all these. And we're going to get more into their background of why it's so hard to reach them. There are missionaries that go to the Middle East and spend years there and never get a single convert. That's very rare for anywhere else in the world, but in the Middle East it's common. Then we're going to get into things that I wish they had told them before they went there so they'd have a better idea, because I've talked to Middle East missionaries who were just so discouraged. And they'd never been told all these things. We need to better understand the faith challenges of those we want to reach. And we also need to redefine in our own minds what success in evangelism is. If we think of success as a conversion, then we're under pressure at all times to push people in some way to help convert them. If that's our goal, and it ultimately is, don't get me wrong, we want them to have salvation. That's a gift of God that we desperately want them to have. But if you think only in terms, I'm unsuccessful unless they convert, then you're hurting yourself and you're taking away the joy that God has designed for us to have in our lives. So you redefine it, and David Geisler says, it's having a spiritual conversation with someone that engages them in such a way that the next time they see us, they want to continue the conversation. You're not pushing, you're asking, you're building relationships. Muslims aren't going to just open up. As I said, if they, and we're going to get into this in a minute, you're going to see just why it's so hard to convert them. And this is the mosque at Al-Azhar. I put that on there and kind of got Mark a little, Mark Gabriel was a little emotional first time he saw that because he used to go there every day. Why is there fear? Well, that's the kind of pictures we have a lot in the Middle East Muslims, right? I mean, that's what we think about. Fanatics. Why are the challenges so deep? Oh, let me back that up for a second. Yeah. Let me... Where'd my... Oh, nice. I've got a clock blocking half my presentation on my view. How do I get rid of that clock without, there we go. Let me guess it's going to go back to the beginning, right? Oh no, it didn't. What is the Muslim mindset? Okay, so here we go. Okay, sorry about that. Why are the challenges so deep? Well, the Quran is the Word of God. We already talked about that. Muslims, part of their mindset is, we believe that everyone on earth, every human is made in the image of God, not the physical image like the Mormons believe, but we believe in the moral and spiritual and mental image of God. Muslims don't believe that. Muslims believe that we are created by Allah, that distant power, in the same way He created palm trees, coconuts, and monkeys, that we're just created beings. We're not in His image. We don't think like Him. Allah is so different from us that when He tells you, you might think you know something, but why would you possibly think you know more than God? So, submission. Anybody know what the Arabic word for submission is? Islam. That's what the word literally means. So a Muslim is one who is submitted. He submitted his mind, his will, his heart, everything to Allah. Whatever Allah tells him, he's going to do it. And that means his mind as well. Whereas the Bible tells us to test the spirits and test all things in the New Testament. Muslims believe that's sinful. And the Muslim mindset is the way they see and evaluate things based on the teachings of the Quran and the Hadith. And the Hadith are the collected sayings, actions, and teachings of Muhammad. They come in many different volumes. There's 6 different, in Sunni Islam, there's 6 different volume collections, 6 different collections reaching 10,000 pages in some cases. Sharia is God's law of how things, the way the universe works. And we know part of it, and that's in the Quran and the teaching of Muhammad. Some parts we don't really know about. There's a difference between Sharia and Islamic law. Sharia is God's plan for how things are supposed to be, and Islamic law is, sorry, Mom. Islamic law is humans attempting to interpret what information they have on the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad and turning it into a legal system. So when you hear Sharia and you hear Islamic law, they're 2 different things. There's overlap. But Sharia is all comprehensive, but we don't know all of it. Islamic law is an attempt by humans to interpret Sharia for human use. Does that make sense? So if you hear an expert on TV say Sharia law, they're not an expert. And I've heard that enough to know that. Now let me tell you what they say. This is I told you they pray the opening chapter of the Quran. This is the last 2 verses of it. I mean, there's 8 verses. Guide us to the straight way, that is, guide us to the, where's that? There it is. Guide us straight way. Straight way is Islam. It's a straight path. It's the way you have to do. It's the rules you have to follow to attain paradise. The way of those on whom you have bestowed your grace, not the way of those who have earned your anger. And this, the in parentheses parts, is the interpretation in English. It's not in the original language. But you see throughout the Quran, it refers to the Jews are the ones who have earned Allah's anger. So that's just there to help remind people what that means. Now, nor of those who went astray, such as the Christians. It says in the Quran again and again, the Jews have made God really angry. Remember I mentioned before about how you turn them into monkeys and pigs. Christians have gone astray. We were given the correct information by Jesus, the prophet of Islam, and then we went our own way with it. And Jews got so messed up, they made God really angry. So they're praying up to 27 times a day, 365 days a year, not to be a Jew or Christian. And then you say, hey, I got something for you. And they're hearing this. Let me tell you what else they're hearing. This one. Oh, you who believe, ye who believe. This is Surah. Surah is a chapter of the Quran. There's 114 chapters. Surah chapter 5, verse 52. O ye who believe, take not the Jews and Christians for friends. They are friends one to another, and whoso among you takes them for friends is indeed one of them. Verily, Allah does not guide the unjust people. Don't be friends with Jews and Christians. There's a website called Islam Q&A where a conservative Middle East scholar writes in English, and a guy asked him, said, listen, I'm a Muslim living in America. There's a Christian guy at work. I'd like to be friends with him. The scholar said, no. Said you can be friendly in the hopes of converting him, but you may not be friends with him. Now, the liberal Muslims will interpret this as that's during a certain battle time. We don't know specifically, but there was problems with Jews and Christians. We had to make sure what was going on, but now that doesn't apply anymore. But they don't really have the historical evidence to back that. But it's like the people who read the Bible and they only read the nice stuff about love your neighbor and say Christianity is love your neighbor. And I know about that because my mom, who just tried to call, that's her version of Christianity. Christianity, in my mom's eyes, could have existed without Christ. It's just a philosophy, teachings. So you got guide us, don't let us become a Jew or a Christian 27 times a day. They know this verse. Don't be friends with those people who come in by. And this is a very important one, chapter 2, verse 109. Many of the people of the scriptures, that's Jews and Christians, wish that if they could turn you away as disbelievers after you have believed, out of envy from their own selves, even after the truth that Muhammad, peace be upon him, is Allah's messenger, has become manifest unto them. That is, we wish to turn them away as disbelievers. We want to convert them. When Jews and Christians talk to you, their primary thought is, I'm here being nice because I want to convert you. So when you meet a Jew or Christian privately and they start talking, be aware, always in the back of your mind, have the defenses up. They're trying to convert you and be ready for that. Yeah.
Are the words in parentheses there what they actually pray or what the...
Well, this is not, I'm sorry.
Says,
Let me
did you put those in there?
the words in parentheses, this is in a specific translation, which they don't call translations, of course. This is not what they pray. Only that first chapter they pray so much. These are just other verses that reflect how they think when they meet us. And this part is what the scholars, the Quran I got this from is a English version, has Arabic and English together, along with teachings of Muhammad, hadith mixed in to help explain the verses. And it was printed at the King Fahd complex in Saudi Arabia. So this is what conservative Muslims read.
Okay, the ones that were prayers.
Yeah, the earlier one.
You had those...
This one, see, that's chapter 1, which is prayed. These are other verses in the Quran, but they're not part of their daily prayers. So if they read the Quran, they're aware of these ideas, and they've taught it sometime during the year, during their weekly sermon, they're taught about this information. So we are jealous of Muslims, and we're going to try to convert them to us, and they should be aware of us, that we only want to convert them if we're friendly to them. Okay, there's different kinds of jihad, and I'm not going to go through every one of them because that would take forever. Jihad in Arabic literally means struggle, exertion, force. So you can struggle to try to be good at praying, you can struggle to fight, you can struggle to try to be a better husband, better wife, better mother. Those are all struggles. Those are all types of jihad within Islam. Jihad an nafs is struggle against own self and desires. That is, I want to do this with my life, but what has Allah called me to do? It's personal desires versus what you're supposed to do. Jihad as-shaitan is a struggle against Satan. We can relate to this. That is, they believe Satan as the tempter. When Iran primarily refers to the U.S. as the Great Satan, and Israel's the Little Satan, by the way. When they refer to us as the Great Satan, they don't mean some attacking force. They mean a tempter. We make movies and TV shows that are attempting to lower their morals and convince them not to be faithful Muslims. So the Great Satan, so struggle against Satan, I think most people in this room would agree that's a good thing. That we should not, we should try to stay away from temptations. Everybody has different temptations. Whatever it is, if it's sinful, then we struggle to fight that. So that part's perfectly understandable. And there's jihad al-kufar, struggle against disbeliever, and that could take different forms, which is either the verbal type I talked about, like in the debate I did, or physical kind. The physical kind, if in traditional Islamic theology, there's two parts of the world nowadays. There used to be up to three. The third part was a group of people, the groups that had treaties with Muhammad. So you had the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, which is Islamic lands. Any country ruled under some form of Islamic law. Dar al-Harb, the House of War, which is everywhere which isn't Islamic. And they used to have a third category, which is the House of Treaty, but they don't have those anymore because Muhammad's not around to make treaties now. So in a traditional Islamic theology, there's only two parts of the world. Either you're part of the House of Islam or you're part of the House of War. This is where some of the violence comes from as far as that part of it goes. Further, if you look further into this history of their concept of jihad, there's three versions of it. There's we Muslims are being attacked, in which case every Muslim has to fight back. You got to protect the Ummah, the group of Muslims. Every Muslim has to take part in defensive fighting. There's offensive fighting, which able-bodied men can take part in. And then there's the third area, in order to make Allah's word supreme around the world, which is conquer the world, not to kill people, not to force conversion, because that's one thing that's been consistent, is that they don't believe in forced conversion. The belief in traditional Islam, the reason they were conquering the Persian Empire, the Middle East, and everything else, and trying to conquer Europe, is because they believe that because they have the final and best revelation of God, if they can conquer our land and force us to live under Sharia, that we as Jews and Christians will recognize how much superior Islam is, and then we'll convert freely. So the fighting wasn't to force conversion. That has to come freely. That's between you and God. The fighting is to force you to live under Islamic law. And so there's a difference there. They weren't trying to slaughter people, because you can't convert dead people. They were trying to do it in the earliest days in the most honorable way possible. You weren't allowed to kill women, children, or priests. Over time, those kind of messages got lost, particularly after the Crusades, where they suddenly said, hey, wait, these Christians are fighting back. And they began to think differently about Christians. So there's two kinds, struggle against disbeliever. There's the verbal and there's the physical kind. Jihad bis-saif and jihad bil-lisan. Jihad of the sword being the physical fighting type, and jihad of the tongue. The key aspect of this, jihad of the sword, is in the Quran. The word jihad appears many times because, as I said, it means struggle in Arabic. If it says struggle in the path of God, that specific phrase refers to violent warfare, as in fighting enemies. So struggle in the path of God is specifically the phrase that means, you see the word jihad or struggle or fight in the Quran without those other words, it may mean different things. It may mean fighting, it may mean other things. But if you see jihad in the path of God or struggle or fight in the path of God, that's specifically to the violent, physical violent type. Islamic doctrines, sin and redemption, predestination. This is about sin and redemption. No soul earns evil but only against itself, nor does any bearer of burden bear the burden of another. Then to your Lord will be your return, and he will inform you of that wherein you used to differ. That is, you bear the punishment for your own sins. You do not inherit sin nature, and no one can sacrifice themselves on your behalf in God's eyes. So we want to tell them, Muslims, that Jesus died for them. And if they read their Quran, they're going to say, well, that's nonsense. Mark likes to say that the Quran is written like an immunization, like an inoculation against Christianity. Every unique Christian doctrine is countered in the Quran itself. The one religion Muhammad was most concerned about corrupting his own religion was Christianity.
Quick question, so just
Yeah.
an observation maybe.
Yeah.
It seems like whenever I see this, and I've seen some verses before, they're a little hard to read. I know it's our translation.
right, right.
We know we've got different authors in our Old Testament and New Testament that using their personalities and,
Right.
and gifts and talent and how they wrote.
Right.
But this is supposed to be God speaking directly to
Yes,
them.
yes.
And it just seems sometimes it's circular and kind of like babbling a little, or it seems poetic on one hand, but on the other hand, it seems really hard to follow.
Yeah, the only miracle Muhammad was told he could do was the Quran itself. That its Arabic is so beautiful and so moving and so amazing that you look at it and you say, only God could produce this much beauty.
Well, that's what I was wondering. Do they see it as beautiful?
Yes,
Or do
but not in
others?
English, of course, because that's not the
Right.
Quran.
Do you speak or do you read the Arabic?
A few basic words, but I wouldn't even attempt to translate a whole sentence at this point. No, I mean, Aleph, Ba, Ta, Jim, Ha, Ka, I can do the alphabet and I can put some words together, but my vocabulary is so limited at this point that I wouldn't even attempt it. But there are a variety of translations. The one I picked up in Indianapolis a couple of years ago was clearly for a Western audience because it's a verse that says men can beat their wives. But the parentheses part, which means not in the original, said lightly. That was written for a Western audience. Yeah. I almost converted when I read that. So no one can sacrifice himself for you. No one can take your sin off you. You do it all yourself. Whomsoever Allah guides, he is the one who follows the right way, and whomsoever he causes to err, these are the losers. Many are the jinns and men we have made for hell. Jinn is a creature made of fire. We call it genie in the stories, the old stories. They're creatures whose nature is fire. And my mom's voicemail, she's really got something on her mind. Allah, this is under predestination, Allah determines. Because He's the only power in the universe, He will guide who He wants. It says in the Quran that many people make schemes and set traps, but Allah is the greatest schemer of them all. That if you want to know where sin comes from, if you're powerless without Allah doing it, how can you sin? Well, Allah causes sin. He punishes you for your intentions, but He causes the sin Himself. He is the father of sins. And it says in here that whomsoever He guides and whomsoever He causes to err, He will cause you to err. In the Bible, it talks about how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It didn't say God caused Pharaoh to be that way. He simply solidified what was already there to make sure that it was very manifest to everyone. This says Allah directly controls everything that happens. Do you go into paradise? This is from the Quran also. This is Muhammad was told. This is the people who say Muhammad forged the Quran because a lot of the stories are folk tales that were popular in the area that suddenly show up in the Quran. And this is the people saying, or do they say he has forged it? And this is God telling Muhammad to say, if I have forged it, you have no power to help me against Allah. He knows very well what you are pressing upon. He, meaning God, suffices as a witness between me and you. He is the all-forgiving, the all-compassionate. And Allah says, say, I am not an innovation among messengers, and I know not what shall be done with me or with you. I only follow what is revealed to me. I am only a clear warner. Muhammad doesn't know where he's going to go. The first caliph after Muhammad died, they decided to go with the election method. It was his father-in-law named Abu Bakr, and they called him the weeping man. And they said, why are you so emotional? Why do you weep so much? He said, because I can see I'm walking on this narrow tightrope, and hell's on this side and paradise is on that side, and I don't know which way I'm going to fall. Now imagine you got this fear of constantly falling into hell. You're trying to follow as close as you can what you want. But if you say God has a partner or a son, or if you say God sacrificed His son, or God's son sacrificed Himself for you, all those cause the tip. Do you want to hear that message? No, you don't want to hear that message. What do you say we should be done by 11:30?
Sheila, can you lock the door?
And this is from the teachings of Muhammad, the Hadith. Talk about a guy who had recently died. This is what Muhammad said. They said, is he in heaven? He was a great Muslim, and Muhammad said, as to him, by Allah, death has overtaken him, and I hope the best for him. By Allah, though I am the apostle of Allah, yet I do not know what Allah will do to me. Muhammad didn't know where he was going.
The eternal security is not really part of that.
He only talked about one group of people that were going in, and that is men who died during jihad. Don't just go in, but each level, 7 levels of paradise, the 7th, the highest level, were for people who died during jihad. So that's what some of the motivation for violence. And I want to be very clear again, the Muslims you meet, they go to the sermons every week to hear about how they should behave. They don't get lectures on theology. They've never thought about these things. For the vast majority, have never even remotely considered it. Yeah.
I have a guy that works for me. I've shared this class before. He's a Muslim. But once again, by culture, not necessarily by faith. So,
yeah.
you know, this is something that I've studied a good bit myself. And so just like bringing these things to him and talking to him about this, he was dumbfounded. He was like, I didn't even know. Like,
Right.
Weird. I was expecting
Right.
him like almost a rebuttal, almost as if like, well, what about this? And oh, I know this. It was almost like I've never heard that before, and I was kind of shocked.
Right. Oh, yeah. It would seem to, particularly Baptists, who we love to study, to read the Bible. Most Muslims have never read the Quran. It's just, so they're there because of the fears and the concerns and the threats and such, or the family tradition. For a Muslim to convert, and I'll get into this in a moment, it's really hard.
Can I say one
Yeah,
thing, though?
sure.
That's why we're talking about converting them. But I do have praise. I've been obviously I get the opportunity just to talk to him about a lot of things. And recently he's kind of opened up to where we were going on a trip and my business partner was like, you know, he riding the car, man, you know, Rob's gonna talk to you about Jesus, and he's like, I'd love to hear it. So it sounds like he's
Yeah. Something's happening, yeah. There's a great movement in the Middle East where Muslims are turning to Christ because of dreams and visions. Have you heard about that movement? It's a major thing happening because of our lack of movement on our part. God doesn't have to have us to do anything. He's not dependent upon us. Although they teach that at SES, he depends on us to speak words into existence, right?
That's basically
Yeah, yeah.
word faith.
Islamic doctrines, I pay for my sin or God's will. He decides that he's leading some people this way. They don't know. That's why she looks confused. Well, part of this is we want to trust the Holy Spirit. If you're going to knowingly go into a meeting with a Muslim that you're going to discuss things, pray. Because the strength of the Holy Spirit's a little bit better than our own. And pray specifically that He gives you a calmness and a peace about you, because that's what they want. They lack that peace, that assurance. They don't have it. They have tension. They have concerns. They have sometimes outright fears about their own lives. Those guys who are killing themselves, suicide bombers, how can I ever do enough to earn paradise after I've been this drug addict sinner? And now, can I ever do enough prayers and enough fasting to make up for that? I don't know. Maybe if I die during jihad, I get in. That's the only way I know I can make it.
I do have a question about that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So, do you really think that these guys really believe that, or is it a certain few that have actual bad intentions, and brainwashed the select that are willing to, you know, that are hurt up maybe based off their past experiences and stuff like that? Because once again, it's like you can almost bring this up to 90% of Muslims, at least over here, and they're like, I've never heard these things.
Well, yeah, that gets back to two things. Number one, as I mentioned before, the Muslims who come over here are more liberal, and they're less into the ritual, less into the formal Islam part of it. It's part of their culture, less so than it's part of their daily life. And so they don't know 90% of what I'm saying. As you said, you bring stuff up to him, he doesn't know. That's typical of American Muslims as opposed to Middle Eastern Muslims. So that's why you're more likely to have Middle East Muslims. and as far as the why they do that, the ones that do the violence and such, they estimate about 2% of Muslims are that way. Out of 1.6 billion Muslims, that's at 32 million only. Yeah, so it's a tiny minority, 2%, believe that you should kill people and do all this stuff. But that still equals so many millions because there's so many million Muslims around the world. And so it makes it seem like people begin to wonder, is my neighbor going to blow me up? Is he going to shoot me? No, not like it's not very likely at all. Most of them are very peaceful, very nice people. But when you get 2% that are willing to die like that, then they're going to taint the rest of them. And the vast majority of Muslims I've ever spent any time with, and I've had some nice conversations with some really nice Muslims, but the vast majority of them would say, that's not my Islam. And then the question becomes, well, under what authority do you define Islam? Are you saying this is just how you personally practice it, or do you say that Islam actually teaches what you're saying? And the answer is they don't really know. They cannot believe that their religion would teach violence. That's all. They think it was necessary in the early days for Muhammad to protect the new community, but that since then things have gotten peaceful. They don't know their history. They don't know the early history. Or they know a certain version of it.
So why aren't they willing to speak out against?
Sure. Muhammad said that if a Muslim should never, under fear of burning in hell, criticize another Muslim in public. So they'll say generic things like, of course I condemn terrorism, of course I condemn murder, but they will never say, of course I condemn Osama bin Laden, because that's forbidden. Their own fate is in doubt if they begin to publicly denounce. And I'll give a specific case. About 12 years ago in Oklahoma City, a Muslim guy wrote a letter to the local paper, said, Osama bin Laden is not a Muslim. These guys are terrorists. They're not Muslims. This is Oklahoma City in America. He belonged to a liberal mosque, a very modern mosque, and the reaction to his letter to the newspaper was he was excommunicated from the mosque because he criticized a Muslim to non-Muslims. You keep it in the house. Yeah.
What about, aren't they taught specifically that they are supposed to lie?
That's a specific doctrine called taqiyya. It's more prevalent under Shiite Islam than under Sunni, but they all believe in it, which is Muhammad said under certain circumstances, it's not just okay to lie, that it's actually a good thing to lie. And he said to bring peace between husband and wife, to bring peace between families, it's okay to lie. So if I cheat on my wife, I get to lie about it, baby. And he said as a strategy in war. And so if you consider the U.S. at conflict with Islam in general, then lying in that context would be not only acceptable, but actually a good thing. And so sometimes they would be okay to lie, but I see less of that in America because most Muslims in America don't know anything about their religion. They really don't.
Peace treaties.
Yeah. Oh, peace treaties can last a maximum of 10 years anyway. Yes, ma'am.
Sort of still on that rabbit trail, but do they think that Allah has the ability to judge in their thoughts? Because, I mean, they might not vocally criticize another Muslim,
Well,
but they inwardly do. Is that
Right, but that's fine. They just don't. It's not supposed. It's like a public relations type idea. You don't do it amongst the other people. You don't divide Muslims against You don't take the side of non-Muslims against Muslims. You within a mosque, you can say that Osama bin Laden is a dirty dog and I hate him. He's not a Muslim. But once you get outside and you're speaking to outsiders, you're like, I condemn terrorism.
Can a Shiite speak against a Sunni?
In a heartbeat.
They
Yeah.
say Muslim, they only mean there.
Well, I mean, ISIS. Everybody knows ISIS. They actually started off as a branch of Al Qaeda in Iraq, and when they broke off, Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent condemned them as being too extreme. If Al Qaeda condemns you as being too extreme, because Osama bin Laden, whose mother was most likely a Shiite, did not want to have Shiites and Sunnis fighting. He wanted to keep it all against they call it the near enemy and the far enemy. The near enemy for Muslims in the Middle East is their own governments because they're not following Islamic law. They're forced, and they're not nice people to start with, and they're not following Islamic law. There's no country in the Middle East that follows 100% Islamic law. So the near enemies, the apostate governments in the Middle East. In Egypt, you got people who leader Al-Sisi, who says he's the Muslim leader and such, and then Anwar Sadat called himself the believer president in Egypt, and then signs a peace treaty with Israel. That's the near enemies. The far enemies is the U.S. and the West. And so the lying part, the Shiite-Sunni thing, ISIS, instead of focusing on the far enemy or the near enemy, said, and Shiites. And so Shiites are worthy of death because they're apostates. They claim to be Muslims, but they don't believe the right stuff because they pray differently and they do things differently. They still believe in one God. They still believe Muhammad's a prophet. They still believe in the Quran. But they believe that some of the chapters of the Quran have been removed. The ones that favor Ali, because they're Shiite, Shia Ali, the supporters of Ali, and they say that the Quran was corrupted and the history was corrupted in order to make the Sunnis the winners, when in fact the Shiites are the true ones. So there's a major conflict there and always has been.
Something interesting Keith Small showed me is that he said he doesn't want to go down this path because it's just going to be truthful, but there's merit to, was Muhammad even an historical individual?
Jay Smith and I used that in the debate, used that kind of thing. Not Muhammad was he a historical, but is his story even close to accurate? And there's evidence to suggest that it's not.
That's what Keith was saying, is that
Yes.
it's not, you're not going to get anywhere with this.
That's kind of like discussing Muhammad's marriages.
Yeah.
Those are non-starters. And if anybody doesn't know what I'm talking about, you can look up what was his not Khadijah, but when Muhammad was 49, he said he was been given a vision or a dream. He wasn't sure what it was. It was something wrapped in silk and held by the angel Gabriel. When he unwrapped it, it was Abu Bakr's daughter. He said, if it's a dream, it'll go away. If it's a vision, it'll come true and you'll be my wife. A year later, they got engaged, and 3 years later, they consummated the marriage. His age during these 3 periods is 49 for the dream, 50 for the engagement, 53 for the consummation. Her ages was 5 years old, 6 years old, and 9 years old. So that's another one I do not like to discuss publicly because it's just too controversial. That and the early history, because and specifically what Eric's getting at, the Quran describes people, groups, and geography that all fits Petra, Jordan. It doesn't fit Mecca. The story is in 622 they changed the direction of the prayer, the Qibla, from Jerusalem to Mecca. That prior to that they prayed towards Jerusalem. But every mosque built for the 150 years of Islam, if you look at them on satellite imagery now, points towards Petra. So it looks like Petra was a major influence, and historically Petra was a major religious center. So it looks like it was much more important, and then probably during the time of the Umayyad dynasty, which started around 680 or so. A guy named Muawiyah killed Ali after he finally became the caliph, and then his family became the dynastic rulers, so that instead of electing new rulers, just the children became the rulers. And he ruled from Syria, not from Mecca or Medina. And there's some evidence to indicate that he may have changed some things around. It's really hard to say because the evidence isn't strong enough one way or the other. But as far as the Quran being uncorrupted, you know the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and the temple? It's got Quran verses in it. Those verses match no verse in any Quran today.
Is that wife's name Zainab?
Not Zainab. Zainab was the one he got from his son Zaid. Zainab was a beauty that Muhammad, Zaid, his adopted son, had a beautiful wife named Zainab that some people say he got during a razzia, during a raid. And Muhammad came by to visit him one day, and she was not fully clothed protectively, and he saw more than he should have, and he became desirous of her as a wife. Muhammad did. And he said, no, that's sinful. That's my son's wife. I can't. And then a new verse of the Quran was revealed where God said, you think you're being holy, but I'm telling you that she's supposed to be your wife. And so Zaid had to divorce her and give her to Muhammad. That's Zainab. Aisha. Aisha is the young wife. And you can look up you can use Wikipedia to see the Aisha. Some Muslims are now trying to rewrite it as she was 13 or something at the time of consummation as opposed to 9. But that's not what the traditional. She says in the traditional stories, she said she was playing with toys when she was taken to the wedding tent. Take that for what you want. If you say this proves he's got a bad personality or whatever, they're not going to listen to you at that point. Besides being a Christian, you're obviously really trying to mess up his religion. You're not just a Christian who's honestly trying to mislead him. You're a Satan follower who's trying to destroy the world. So I just don't even go there with those two. There's good evidence to support all that. Like the satanic verses, they're good evidence for the satanic verses. That comes from Ibn Kathir, his biography. That's you guys know the story of the satanic verses. You know the book by Salman Rushdie that was such a controversy. The early Muslim historians say that Muhammad really, really wanted the people in Mecca to join his religion, his family, his relatives. And they said, can't you, we're trying to meet you halfway. Can't you, we got all these idols we worship. You say, well, how we say these idols reach out to the high God. Can't you just give us part way? And so Muhammad got a new verse that said that 3 of them, Allat, Uzza, and I forgot the third one. But anyway, these 3 idols, that they could be used as emissaries to God. That it's okay to use those idols. And his followers who had lost their families and everything to follow him are like, what's up with that? You tell us we can't have any, but your family can, but ours. And he said later, what happened was Satan tricked me into revealing those verses, hence the name Satanic Verses. And then the correct version came back later, which said, don't use those. Those 3 idols are mentioned in the Quran, but it says don't follow them. And the original version, according to the early Muslim biographers, said that he was fooled. But that leads to a problem later on where Christians started saying, wait a minute, he was fooled then. When else was he fooled? And that just led to a whole thing. So at this point, that's another area that historically there's good evidence for that, very good evidence for that. Aisha, there's excellent evidence for her young age, no doubt about that. The location, that's got some good evidence for it. Yes, sir?
In their evidence of, I can't even think of the instance, and you probably know right off the top of your head where there were a whole bunch of different scriptures that were being passed around, and Nabil Qureshi wrote it in his book about what it would take for, like, because they often say that the scriptures have been corrupted.
Right.
And he says the only way for that really to happen is for an overarching ruler to take in and bring in all the scriptures, and then doing that, burn all the other ones, and then a historical evidence of a revolt, and then the repassing out of scriptures. And so there's no evidence of any revolt or anything like that happened in Christian faith, but however that happened in
Uthman's reign.
Yeah, so can you explain?
Sure. Well, Christianity, I mean, there's entire New Testaments available that predate Muhammad. There's verses, there's chapters and pieces that Dan Wallace at Dallas Theological Seminary says date to the 1st century. The oldest confirmed one is the Chester, the bottom, John Ryland's papyrus of the Chester Beatty Museum in England, and that dates to the 1st third of the 2nd century. So it's from the Gospel of John. So within 40 years or so of when John wrote his Gospel, there's a piece of his Gospel still available that close to the original time. There's entire New Testaments that predate Muhammad's time, and in the Quran it says when Jews and Christians look in the Scriptures, they see it predicts him. And so Christians say, no, it doesn't. And they say, well, your scriptures have been corrupted, like the Quran says. That's why it's out of there. So when they say that the Christians corrupted everything, though they say typically it's Paul did it, Saul of Tarsus, the Jew, because Jews are bad guys, that he took Jesus, the Muslim prophet, and turned him into Jesus, the Son of God, and that corruption started that early, and that the copies we have now are not from that time, therefore. But what he talks about what they call the Uthmanic recension. As I said before, the earliest Muslims were required to recite the Quran from memory. It's supposed to be memorized. The Quran means recitation. You're supposed to memorize, recite it. Well, those wars of expansion I was talking about, what happens when all your memorizers start to die? You better get down something written before they're all gone. So Uthman, Muhammad died 632, then Abu Bakr took over, he lived to 634, then Umar, he lasted to 644, and then Uthman, who lasted another 15 years during Uthman's time, the 3rd caliph. these guys were all dying off. And he said, I want every written version you can find to bring together, and we're going to put together an official Quran. And so you get verses from Mecca period and Medina period mixed together in the current Quran. And he got all the verses, all the written copies they had possibly available, and burned them all and printed the official version of Islam. So exactly what you're talking about, where there was a leader who made an official Quran. So we don't know for certain what the original Quran said because they burned them all. However, in the 1970s in Sana'a in Yemen, in the top of a mosque, they found thousands and thousands of ancient leather. What do they call the leather? The vellum manuscripts. And on the rescriptus, where you would get leather, was expensive to write on. So when you wanted to write a new book, you either paid a lot of money for new leather, or you erased the old stuff off and wrote new stuff. Well, in this one, they using the special microscopes with special ultraviolet imagery and such, were able to read the original script. And the original script is the entire chapters and verses of the Quran that are different than the Quran we have now. Gerd Puin, G-E-R-D, first name, last name, P-U-I-N, is a German scholar who was in charge of discovering. That's in the 70s. The Saudi Arabia, who was financing all this, said to him, you will no longer have any access to these documents or anything else if you tell what you are saying right now. Because he said in the magazine, this completely destroys the whole Quran history. And then shortly thereafter, he started saying, hey, the Quran's, this proves how good the Quran is. So there's good evidence to suggest that he, wanting to keep access to those documents, was willing to fudge a little bit in interviews. But his original interview was, this completely messes up everything. So we don't know what the original Quran said because there's no ancient documents that you can compare, like New Testament. There's changes, but you can say, well, this verse shows up in Ethiopia, Abyssinia. This verse shows up here, and it's in the 4th century. So this, you track it back, and this is the original. You can redo the original New Testament with more than 95% certainty. Some say up to 99% certainty. The Quran, you can't do that because you don't have anything to compare it to. I'm sorry, you going to say something?
So, two things. I don't know if you saw the news article that came out today. I guess there was a fragment found of the Quran that's supposed to be quite historic. I don't know how old.
I did not see that. I was driving all day.
Yeah. And on it, what they found, this is what made it unique. This actually was being sold in an auction house. And somebody noticed that there was some very faded writing behind it, and they found it was, I'm trying to think of which book in the Old Testament, but they had basically taken Judaism's scripture
And erased it.
written over it.
Yeah.
And they were saying how this kind of proved the influence that Jews.
Well, there's no doubt. Anybody who reads the Quran can see the Jewish influence just from the teachings of it. I mean, there's dietary laws, there's fastings, there's all sorts of things. They even have sacrifice, like in Judaism, but in Islam, sacrifice doesn't do you any good. So it's just, you're like, why do you sacrifice an animal? Well, you said you pay for your own sins. That doesn't make any sense. Well, if you're borrowing stuff from previous religions.
So is he supposed to be a liar or a lunatic? Kind of going back to Jesus, liar, lunatic, or Lord.
Yeah,
So
the
in this case,
the trilemma.
Lord, but which one is the popular thoughts there?
I'm reading a book right now about him from a European guy, and I don't know the European scholar's credentials, so I don't know how accurate it is. But his theory is it's a combination of obsessive-compulsive disorder with epilepsy, such that like the ritual prayers and all that would fit the obsessive-compulsive disorder. The epilepsy would provide the aural visions and such like that. And his obsessive-compulsive disorder would make that everyone has to do it, would mean that everyone has to do it a certain way. And so his theory is it's a combination of those two. I kind of like that. Some Christians like the demonic influence theory or demonic possession theory.
That's a pedophilia on there too.
Once again, there's some things I just don't go there
Yeah,
in
you don't wanna
public.
say that, you
In
know.
private conversations, I may be a little more free with, hey, how are you? He's a good guy. I didn't know if you knew.
That guy has some chains, dude.
That's. Are we at the end? Yeah,
and
'cause
what
I
I
don't-
want to do is, why don't you, anything to wrap it up, but like you said,
Yeah.
I told them months ago that there are speakers and there are teachers, and speakers are awesome, Josh McDowell, and there are teachers like me and you
they just teach until the time's up, and it's like, oh, time's up, and so it's like right. In the
Right,
middle.
right.
So they're used to it.
Well, as I told you guys here, I got hours and hours of stuff we could go through, but I simply don't. We don't have time to go through it. If I could just say one quick thing, when you have questions, never confront them as a challenge because it gets back to make Allah's word supreme. They'll fight back. You have to ask it in terms like this. Let's say Eric Abdullah here is. He says that God can forgive anyone he wants, and God is just. I say, I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate it, and I think there's much I really, really appreciate about Islam, but I'm a little bit confused about this. Maybe you can help me understand, Abdullah. How do you reconcile that God is just and He can forgive anyone? Say a guy from down the street murders my family and robs my house when I'm gone. Are you saying Allah could just forgive him? How is that just? How do you personally, I'm not asking you for an official theological, how do you personally deal with those kind of questions? You see how I'm not attacking him? I'm just trying to help understand how he thinks and how he feels. But I'm bringing a dilemma there. Allah's either just or He's forgiving. He can't be both because there's no one paying the penalty. That's the huge advantage Christianity has. Someone has paid the penalty. In Islam, no one's paid the penalty. Allah simply forgives whoever He wants to forgive. And so there's no real justice in Islam.
Precious.